how that works. I think that's everything. So I'm going to hand it over to Priscilla to introduce our guest speaker today.
Hi, everyone. For those of you who know me, I'm from the Immigrant Education Society. And I am so pleased to have John Wang, my colleague as well. He is from the Immigrant Education Society, but he's also a psychologist in training, finalizing his last year in the school and child psychology program at University of Calgary. John has a well-rounded understanding of mental health, as well as he's currently working as the mental health counselor at our organization. So John has a multi-tiered system of interventions aimed at promoting psychosocial well-being, and he's also a staunch advocate for early intervention. So we are so happy today to have John Wang to share more about this topic that I believe would be relevant to a lot of us ESL practitioners and administrators. So I'm going to hand over the time to John.
Thank you, Priscilla, for that lovely introduction. And with your permission, I would like to present my screen with the PowerPoint on it. Can everyone see my PowerPoint in the full screen view?
Yes.
Okay,
yeah.
Perfect. So good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining me on this lovely Saturday morning and learning about this very special topic for all of us, learning disability and learning difficulty. So I've already gone through, or rather Priscilla has already gone through a short bio of myself.
And John, can I just quickly
Yes.
interrupt and remind the participants to mute your mics if you're not talking so that there won't be the background sound. Thank you.
Thanks. And I also want to remind all participants that if at any point in time they have a question, feel free to either just unmute yourself and let everyone know what your question is, or you can type in your question through the chat box. And I believe Priscilla, as well as I think Nancy, will be monitoring the chat box. And they will let me know as well if there is a relevant question for me to answer.
Okay.
And I would really welcome your participation in this workshop here. So just looking at a brief objective for what we are going to talk about today. So my first hope is that we will have a understanding and be able to identify the major types of learning disabilities. Also, we're going to examine and be able to recognize the early signs and symptoms of learning disabilities. And lastly, we will talk about and hopefully learn some effective interventions that you can use to help and support your students in their different modes of learning. So are there any questions before we begin? All right, if not, I'll jump right into it. So just a brief check of your prior knowledge. Based on your own experiences and education, what are some examples of learning disabilities that you can think about? As well, how would you define learning disabilities and what makes it different than a learning difficulty? Would anyone like to take a crack at these questions? And of course, I don't expect anyone here to be an expert in this area, so there are no right or wrong answers here.
So someone's asking, will the PowerPoint slides be shared?
Yes, they will be shared.
Yep, great, thank you. Oh, and yep, Nancy replied that as well.
And one person said the learning disability they think of right away is dyslexia.
Right, dyslexia is definitely one of those learning disabilities that we're going to talk about today. Slow processing speed, absolutely. We're going to talk about that as well. Yep. Yes, I'm glad you really you brought that up. Disability versus difficulty versus learning style are sometimes difficult to assess. And yet we're going to talk about all three of them today because learning style is something that we all possess, right? We're all different types of learners. So some of us are, for example, visual types of learner. Some of us are the read and write type of learner. Some of us are kinesthetic types of learner, and that means we like to use our body movements. We like to use action to stimulate our learning. And some of us are auditory learners, right? We learn best by listening to information through the auditory route. But that doesn't mean that we have difficulty in the other areas of learning domain, right? So just because most of us are, for example, visual learners, that doesn't mean we're not able to understand and process information through the auditory route. So for someone who has, for example, a specific deficit in one of those learning routes, so auditory, visual, and they really struggle in learning, in acquiring and processing information, then we would consider that a learning difficulty. Now, the severity of that and the frequency of how that learning deficit impacts their daily lives and impact their learning might not be sufficient enough to warrant a clinical diagnosis. So when it hits that critical threshold of, say, it's really impacting their daily learning, they're not able to reach the same grade level expectation for their age, then we would consider that a learning disability, right? That's only when that learning difficulty reaches a certain kind of a threshold, then we would ask them to seek out a professional, such as a psychiatrist or a educational psychologist, to make that diagnosis. And I see that we have nonverbal learning disability. Absolutely, we're going to talk about that as well. Dysgraphia, yes, that's a disability with regard to writing. And then we have short-term memory problems. Yes, we're going to talk about that as well. And also how different diagnosis other than learning disability might affect your memory. And dyscalculia, very good. That is a disability when it comes to mathematical processing, right? And this is something that's also very, it happens very, quite commonly with dyslexia, right? So those two often go hand in hand. So, so someone asked, is PTSD considered a learning disability? Now, the answer to that is no. PTSD is not considered a learning disability. However, what I would like to talk about is how many mental health diagnoses or mental health concerns would impact learning. Similar in ways to how a learning disability would affect your ability to learn. So for someone who is suffering from PTSD, they might be triggered when they're in a classroom setting, right? So even the loud closing of a door in the classroom might remind them on a subconscious level of a, for example, a car accident that they were involved in, or an incident of a terror attack, right? So that loud bang of the door would disrupt their ability to learn for quite some time, because that loud sound has triggered an automated response in their brain that puts them in a flight or fight response, right? And as we all know, when we are in that kind of a situation, for example, when you see a black bear while hiking in the Rockies, all of a sudden your body freezes, right? Or you're automatically wanting to run. Your heart rate accelerates, your body begins to sweat, and you feel like there's nothing else you can do at that moment except to think about how you're going to run away from this terrible situation, or how you are going to fight off this adversary, right? So when that happens, your learning is really put on the side burner and you're no longer engaged in learning. So that's a very good question. Thank you for bringing that up. And yeah, someone mentioned how the frequency and intensity as well as duration of the learning difficulty matters as well when it comes to whether or not you warrant that diagnosis. And that's the same when it comes to many of the developmental concerns, developmental disorders, or even mental health disorders that we see. It's frequently those three criterias that are the deciding factor to whether someone should receive a diagnosis or not. And another question I see here is that, do people acquire learning disabilities in a similar way to the disabilities that you discuss? So which disabilities are you referring to? So are we talking about physical disabilities, developmental disabilities, or something that's, oh, I meant the disability versus acquired difficulties. Okay, so let me clarify here. So learning disability and learning difficulties most of the time are what we consider developmental concerns. So the reason why we call these developmental concerns is because these limitations manifest during infancy or childhood or adolescence. And we can know that because there is a delay in reaching developmental milestones, or there is a apparent lack of function in one or multiple domains. And these could include cognition, motor performances, vision, hearing, or speech. And these are something that's really the individual acquires or shows, demonstrates as they age. And these limitations might not be apparent until they reach a certain age. So for someone with, for example, dysgraphia, so this is a disability when it comes to writing, you would really not see that as an apparent difficulty until they reach the age in which they are expected to write, right? You wouldn't see that at, let's say, age 4, because that is not the developmentally appropriate age for a child to start writing, right? So even though they may already most likely have this difficulty inherent within themselves at that age, they would not be diagnosed. It would be very difficult for anyone to notice that this young person, has this difficulty. Now, with regard to the ELL population, that becomes even more difficult for you to recognize it early. And the reason for that is because, first of all, for the literacy learners, so for the adult literacy learners, say that they have dysgraphia, okay? But for the better half of their life, there is no way for anyone to have noticed that, because they were never expected to write in their first language, right? And when that was not apparent during that critical developmental period, then how do you tease apart the possibility that they have dysgraphia versus simply they didn't have that enriched environment during that critical period of development, right? Because keep in mind, for many of these skills that we're going to talk about today, there is a developmentally critical period and there is a developmentally sensitive period in which they can learn those skills. So one psychology experiment I want to mention here is in regard to cats. So previously, some psychologists have performed experiments on infant cats in which they surgically stitch their eyes. And of course, this is not the kind of experiment that we would condone this day, but this was something that happened many decades ago, where ethics weren't as robust as they were today. But they were able to stitch shut those infant cats' eyes. And when they removed those stitching, a year or two later, they found out that those cats were effectively blind, even though there were nothing inherently biologically wrong with those cats. So that just speaks to this idea of developmentally critical and developmentally sensitive period when it comes to acquiring skills, right? If you're never taught skills like writing, if you're never taught skills like listening via reading and writing, then you would have missed that developmentally sensitive period in which it was the easiest for you to acquire that skill. And now, when they're literacy learners in adulthood, it becomes extremely difficult for them to pick up those skills. So because of that, it is very hard to tease apart the fact that, if they have a learning disability versus if they are just not given a enriched environment for learning to begin with. Does that answer everyone's questions? All right, perfect. So thanks for the very engaging questions there. And I see many of you already have a very solid foundation on learning disabilities. So as we have already talked about briefly, a learning disability is for someone who has trouble processing, organizing, and applying information in specific areas of learning, right? And this differs from just learning difficulty, because learning difficulty, even though it also refers to significant learning problems in an academic area, these problems are frequently not enough to warrant an official diagnosis. However, learning disability, on the other hand, is an official clinical diagnosis, whereby the individual meets the certain criteria as determined by the professional. And the difference is in the degree, the frequency, and intensity of the reported symptoms. So the two should not be confused, even though it is commonly interchanged. So let's quickly talk about the rates of learning disability as reported by Statistics Canada. So the term disability encompasses many different conditions, and they include both physical, mental, and developmental disabilities, as well as chronic diseases. So more children in this country have a learning disability than all other types of disabilities combined. Now that's for the adolescent population. As for the adult population, learning disability still constitutes 2.7% of all disabilities combined. Of course, as people age, you will frequently see more disability in the areas of flexibility, mobility, dexterity, and chronic pain. But even then, learning disability still constitutes a significant portion of overall adult disabilities. So that just goes to show that learning disability not only impacts children, but also impacts adults in very significant manner. And here is just a brief history of learning disability. So the term learning disability was actually termed in 1963 by psychologist Samuel Kirk. So at that time, learners with learning disabilities were referred to by terms such as perceptually handicapped, brain injured, or neurologically impaired. And back then, there were not any specialized services or interventions that were supporting or assisting children or adults with learning disabilities. So now let's talk a little bit about the different causes of learning disabilities. Now, there isn't a single cause for learning disabilities, similar to mental health diagnosis, right? As we know, there isn't, a singular cause when it comes to mental health disorders, but rather we can talk about two kind of areas that are of interest. One is called risk factors, and the other one is called sorry, the term is skipping my mind here. One is called risk factor, and the other one is called protective factor. That's right. So risk factors are those factors, whether they're biological or environmental, that puts a person more at risk for developing a learning disability. Whereas protective factors are those that reduces the possibility of developing learning disabilities. So what we do know in terms of learning disabilities is that they're neurological in nature. All right, and so this has to do with our central nervous system. And they might be caused by a variety of factors. So some of them are considered hereditary. So these are things that could be passed down from parents to their children. However, we have not been able to identify a specific genetic sequence that constitutes two learning disabilities. It could also be impacted by environmental factors that are pre-birth. So, something we can think about is, a lack of oxygen to the brain before and during birth. It could be air losses due to suffocation or drowning. And also, when we talk about environmental factors post-birth, many other factors can contribute to learning disabilities from a very young age, including smoking, being exposed to lead paint, being exposed to both illegal and prescription drugs. And there are also certain medical conditions that could present as risk factors to learning disabilities. One of them is middle ear infection. Any questions regarding this slide? Okay. So just a few facts about learning disorder that I want to talk about here. The first one is that students with learning disabilities are not simply lazy, right? And this is something that we might frequently oversee. We might see a student, whether it's a child or an adult, either running away from specific learning task, or they appear to be very fidgety. They appear to be overcome with anxiety, and we may think we might jump to the conclusion that, oh, they're just not interested in learning, right? They're doing anything they can to avoid doing this learning task. And because of that, we identify those students as either lazy or they're just disruptive. They're not a good student, essentially. But the fact of the matter is, we sometimes need to change our perspective in a way that allows us to explore the possibility that those students are escaping from those learning tasks, not because they're a bad student, but because they're struggling with those learning tasks in a way that may not be easily identifiable, or that students just doesn't want to share with the teacher, right? For fear of stigma, for fear that it may impact their immigrant status. So again, just a side note here, for many years, the Canadian immigration system has a policy in which newcomers cannot be granted residency status if they have a medical illness or disability that would put an excessive amount of strain on the Canadian healthcare system. Right? I know that I think earlier, either this year or just last year, they were able to remove and reconsider that clause because it was considered discriminatory at that time. But for the longest time, for a person with either a learning disability or, for example, intellectual delay, they were either not granted residency status, or if they were, then they kept their condition under wraps, right? So these are all part of the reason why a student might not want to share this information with you.
And John, can I ask a question about that?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, so sorry, there's some echo. Yeah, so if let's say someone is diagnosed with a learning disability, an adult or newcomer, from my understanding, there is a lot less resources and things that, interventions that they can access as an adult versus if you were a child.
That's right. You're absolutely right. And the reason for that is because most of the research that has gone into intervention for learning disabilities were focused on kind of that critical childhood period. And that goes back to that whole concept about that time period as developmentally sensitive, as developmentally critical, right? So you get to see the most benefit if interventions were applied during that time period. And because of that, there were less research has gone into adult intervention strategies, and specifically with regard to adult ELL learners, the amount of research has been very scarce. So at the end of our presentation today, I am going to share some universal best practices to support various learning styles and individuals with learning difficulties. So those are universal strategies that you can try out in your own learning environments to support ELL learners. So thank you for that question, Priscilla.
Oh yeah, so I think that it is very worrying if, let's say, the students have that fear, that it might affect their status. And the thing is, I'm just thinking, even if they were diagnosed with a learning disability, it's not like I don't think it would drain a lot of resources, because there are very limited resources to begin with. So I was just wondering about that. I hope no one is denied entry to Canada because they have dyslexia, for example. Yeah,
that's right. And I think the reasoning behind the government's kind of initial guidelines on accepting residency is that they want to bring in individuals whom they think will be net producers in a society, right? So they want these immigrants to be able to help build our society and not drain excessive amounts of resources. But as you said, as adults, they really don't strain that much resources. So I think, I really welcome the government's new agenda in accepting, immigrants for who they are, as just human beings like everyone else. So thank you for bringing that point again.
Yeah, John, and there's also someone in the chat box that says, is there a cultural stigma as well?
Absolutely. So when I mentioned stigma, that really is what I would consider ethno-cultural specific. So, for example, in many cultures in the world, due to the different pace of development between countries. So here in Canada, we're a first world country. Our research in learning disability is at the very forefront in comparison to every other country in the world. But on the other hand, when we're talking about the lower income bracket countries, like many in Asia, many in Africa, in the Middle East, their understanding of learning disability is not on par with that of Canada. They might not see learning disability as anything different than a cognitive delay, as low intellectual ability, all right? And in those countries, it is very frequent for people to label people with kind of a lower intellectual ability with some very stigmatized terms, right? Even here in Canada, if you think back a few decades ago, it's very frequent occurrence for someone to be called stupid or dumb or any one of those discriminatory terms when they're struggling with academic work, right, at the same grade level as their peers. So as you can imagine, this is not the kind of label that people want to be placed on themselves. So in order to avoid those labeling, it would become very easy for people to avoid, even in a state of self-denial, and say, I don't have learning disability. I don't have there's nothing wrong with me. Everyone struggles the same way as I do. And I want to mention this because I've encountered many clients who have said, I don't have a mental health issue. I don't have any type of learning issue because my parents told me everyone struggled the same way, right? And when I probed a little bit further, it became quite apparent that this was a hereditary concern that their parents have also exhibited. So for example, depression, right? Or dysgraphia, they were telling me that their parents were also, ruminating a lot, that they were also engaged in crying spells frequently, or that they were having trouble writing, going back a few different generations. But when those clients were at a very young age, and they brought those concerns up to their parents when they first discovered that, hey, there's a discrepancy between me and my peers, guess what their parents said? Oh, don't worry, Junior, we all suffered, like we all have the same problems, so it's not a problem at all, right? So when you're being taught at a very young age that there is nothing wrong with you, it becomes a self-confirmation bias, right? That, there is nothing wrong with me. Everyone else suffers the same way as I do. Yep, and definitely there is a pride issue in a test-based culture, right? Especially when you're growing up in a school system where, marks and grades are everything. You don't want to be seen as kind of the failure, as the person that brings dishonor to your family and yourself. And because there is a hereditary component to learning disability and to mental health concerns overall, many of the families would deny the fact that there is this hereditary trait within the family as a risk factor, just because they think, oh, if we admit to this, no one else would want to ever marry into our family, right? Because then the offspring would have a heightened chance of developing certain developmental concerns or to develop certain mental health diagnosis, right? So again, that is something that is heavily ingrained in many cultures. Okay, so I see another comment here that says, in the adult ELL environments, there seems to be very little support for learning disabilities. Teachers have been asking for assessments and support for a long time. It adds extra stress for all. Would you be discussing where the students or teachers can go for help? So two different scenarios I can think about here. One is that you're working for a not-for-profit education institute that focuses on adult ELL learners. So for example, the LINK program or a drop-in ESL program. And the other environments would be if you're working for a school district, like the Calgary Board of Education or the Catholic School Board. Would everyone just type in the chat box in which setting that they're practicing in? So that will give me a better idea on what kind of support is available. Okay, Link. Calgary Catholic, okay. Okay, I see that the majority of the respondents have been teachers teaching LINK program. So previous to my role here at the Immigrant Education Society as a mental health counselor, I was actually the quality of life supervisor at our LINK program for just over a year. So in that capacity, I was actually doing quite a few screening assessments for LINK students who are suspected to have learning disabilities. And I was also putting together individualized learning support plans for their teachers to implement with very individualized interventions. But I know not every educational institutes across Alberta have such positions. So unfortunately, I would say it is very difficult for LINK programs to receive the level of support that my LINK program had received. And in terms of for the few that were working at the different school boards, you do have school psychologists for the different divisions or for the different school boards. Unfortunately, it is still very difficult to provide a formal diagnosis just because we would first need to learn kind of the student's prior history of learning difficulties in their first language. And many of the diagnostic assessment tools that we use have to be administered in their first language or ideally in both languages, so both in English and their first language, to be able to have a high degree of fidelity. So a high level of confidence for us to say, yes, this student is indeed suffering from a learning disability. And we know it's not anything else like ADHD or any other developmental concerns. So that's the concern with regard to providing a proper diagnosis. However, with most psychologists, they will still be able to provide you with a list of individualized interventions that you can take back to your students. So I see Janice here has said that she would like me to continue my presentation without interruption and just have a Q&A after each part. Would that be ideal for everyone?
I think a lot of people, like there were a few comments above, I think they're really excited to see like what are some solutions that they can implement in the classroom. I think that's why.
Okay, perfect. I'll try to get to the solution part then. Thank you for that suggestion. Right, so something else that we want to learn about learning disability is that a learning disability is not the same as an intellectual disability. So this is otherwise known as a general learning disability or mental retardation. And this is a stigmatized term that were used previously. So, a decade or two ago, they were the terms being coined. So nowadays, we would consider this just as an intellectual disability. And this also means that students with a learning disability typically do not have low intelligence. And something else we should remember is that language difficulties, by virtue of being an ELL student or literacy students, does not equal to having a learning disability. And again, this is also part of the reason why it is very difficult to provide a proper assessment. Something else we should be mindful of is that bad teaching does not cause a learning disability. But sometimes we see like a student has not been placed in a nurturing or enriched learning environment. So for example, perhaps in their home country, schooling was not done in a systematic way, and they were no explicit phonemic awareness instruction, for example. And when they come to Canada, you might see that they have a specific difficulty in that area. However, if with targeted intervention in, say, phonemic awareness, those students are able to quickly jump ahead and reestablish that area of learning. So when you see occurrences like that happening, you know that students did not have a learning disability. Something else I want to mention is that low socioeconomic status also does not cause learning disability. However, things like lead paint that might be used in a lower income household might be contributing factors to learning disability. And something else I want to mention is that with appropriate educational support, students with learning disability can attain at least an average achievement in their benchmarks. So before I jump into the different types of learning disability and the different ways for assisting students with varying types of learning disability, why don't we take a 5-minute break here? I see that we've reached the 45-minute mark of our presentation now. Would that be a good idea?
We could just reconvene in about 9:50, 9:51, and that gives 5 minutes for a quick stretch. Well, why don't we go ahead and do that? And then just when you come back, just put a message in the chat box just to say you're back. And when we have the majority, we'll just get going again. Does that sound okay? Okay, thanks. Okay. We'll see you in a few minutes.
All right, I think we can begin now. I see most of us are back already. All right, so I would like to continue talking about the different types of learning disability. So as the majority of us have already a basic understanding of learning disability, the four types of learning disability on this page are the most common ones that you will encounter. So the first one is dyslexia, which is a language and reading disability. The second one is dyscalculia, and this is when a person encounters problems with arithmetic and math concepts. And this is important not just to the regular school-age children, but also for adult learners, especially the literacy learners, when you're teaching them the English names for the different times, for dates, and for calculating, simple math. This could become very apparent to you when a student struggles in this domain.
Dysgraphia is a writing disorder resulting in illegibility of their writing. And dyspraxia is a sensory integration disorder when they have problems with motor coordination. And the next four are the ones that you might are somewhat more rare in comparison to the four that we just talked about. So these four are central auditory processing disorder, nonverbal learning disorders, visual perceptual and visual motor deficits, and language disorder. So here is just a visual representation of the major learning disability and which domains of learning or which domains of academics that they will impact. So here are the skill areas that may be affected by learning disabilities. So the first one is receptive and expressive language. There is also auditory or phonological processing, visual motor processing, visual processing, attention/concentration, memory, metacognition. And metacognition is about thinking about thinking, or becoming aware of one's own awareness, or any of those higher order thinking skills. This refers to the process used to plan, monitor, and assess one's understanding and performance. And this is also a critical awareness of one's ability to learn and oneself as a thinker and a learner. And the last two skills that are impacted would be organizational study skills as well as social skills. So I want to briefly talk about disorders of attention. This is because many of the learning disabilities that we're going to talk about would impact the attention part of the learning domain. And this is when you will notice your students is not as focused when a lesson is presented. They might exhibit very short attention span. They might be easily distracted by noises or other types of visual stimuli. They might exhibit poor concentration and may also display hyperactivity. In terms of oral language difficulties, this is where we might see an underlying language disorder, and the students themselves will exhibit problems in language development, in listening, speaking, and vocabulary. For students with learning disability, they might also lack phonological awareness. So this means they're poor at recognizing the sounds of language, and they cannot identify phoneme sounds in spoken language, and they cannot manipulate those sounds. For students with learning disability, they may also have poor cognitive strategies for learning. This means they do not know how to go about the task of learning and studying, and they lack organizational skills. They have very passive learning style, so not looking for a learning style that best suits their learning needs. And they do not direct his or her own learning. So I would say this is an area that the majority of your students will struggle with if they have a learning difficulty or a learning disability. And actually, to combat this, I have made a specific presentation to teach ELL students on what are the best learning strategies for their learning style. And I will share that presentation at the end of this presentation, and I will also email that PowerPoint to to Nancy as well, and she could distribute that amongst all of you. And for a student with, specifically we're talking about dysgraphia, they might exhibit poor motor abilities. And this is where you might notice a very abnormal pencil grip. And in terms of the gross motor abilities, they may exhibit just general awkwardness and clumsiness when they're walking about in the classroom. As for writing difficulties, you will see that students with a deficit in this area would be poor in tasks that require written expression, spelling, and handwriting. With regard to social skills, this is when a student might not know how to act and talk in social situations. They may find it difficult in establishing satisfying social relationships and friendships. So this is where we might see a lack of soft skills, as we typically talk about. As for deficits in mathematics, you will see a student struggling with difficulties with quantitative thinking, with arithmetic, calculation, time, space, and calculation facts would also be very difficult for them to grasp. Now, for reading difficulties, this is the most common learning disability or learning difficulty among all children and adults. So about 80% of students with learning disabilities have disabilities in reading. They will have problems in learning to decode words. They will have problems in basic word recognition skills or reading comprehension. So how do you know if your student has a learning disability? Now, most students exhibit uneven areas of ability. And this is what we talk about when we talk about learning styles, right? We all have different learning styles. We have our preferred ones, and we have the ones that we're perhaps not very good in. But essentially, for the majority of us, the deficits that we have in particular learning styles are not detrimental enough to warrant a diagnosis, and we can compensate for that lack of learning ability. However, for these students, they will struggle in that area even in their first language. So that's kind of the first telltale sign that you would have that a student has a learning disability. But at the same time, as we discussed before, this is not something that many students will openly admit to, and it often takes time and experience for you to develop the relationship necessary to have that conversation with them. But something to remember is that for a student to have a learning disability, they would need to have average or above average intelligence. They would appear physically normal, and they may or may not already have a diagnosis at that time. So something else I want to talk about here is ADHD. Now, I want to make it clear that ADHD is not a learning disability, but rather it mimics some of the signs and symptoms of learning disability. And you will see that the symptoms I have on the slide may very well be true for a student who has a learning disability. So they could be hyperactive, they could be impulsive, fidgety, inattentive, or disorganized. They could also exhibit unreasonable emotional negativity. They could exhibit emotional outbursts. They might be frustrated over very minor issues. And all of these characteristics will vary with age. So of course, if you're dealing with an adult learner, you will often see that many of the symptoms here have either subsided or reduced. But at the same time, we must not mistake ADHD with learning disabilities, even though both of them are considered developmental concerns or developmental disorders. All right, so now we're getting to the instructional ideas for those with a learning disability. So you don't have to copy any of these down because this PowerPoint will be shared with you. So these teaching strategies are what's known as universal teaching strategies. Because what research have shown is that all of these study strategies not only work for those with learning disability, but work for all kinds of learners. So the first one here is explicit phonemic awareness instruction. And we have structured and systematic phonemics instruction, explicit instruction in comprehension strategies, peer assisted learning and reciprocal learning strategies. And this is something I want to talk specifically about because this has been shown to be very effective in teaching reading comprehension strategies to ELL learners with learning disabilities. And when you're using this approach, teachers would instruct students in specific reading comprehension strategies. And when students are proficient in them, they take turns leading peers in discussing the text using these comprehension strategies, right? So when the students are not only taught these strategies, but they're also being asked to demonstrate and teach others using these strategies, that's when research has shown that they were able to learn best. You can also use visuals to reinforce concepts and vocabulary, and also to use gestures and facial expressions to teach vocabulary and to clarify the meaning of content. So the last two here really talks about a multimodal method of learning. And this is very important, and I'm sure many of you have already known this for many years, is that ELL learners learn best when you engage the different senses when it comes to learning, right? And the reason behind that is because your class is going to be made up of students with different learning styles, right? Some of them are visual, some of them are auditory, some are read or write learners, and some of them are kinesthetic, right? So when you're engaging all of those learning modes, when teaching a concept, you're going to be able to reach out to all of your students that way. So here are a few more learning strategies that you can implement. You can repeat and summarize oral lecture notes and give students written versions of key points. So again, a strategy like this would work very well for a student who has trouble in learning auditorily, but rather they can read and write well. And the next point here is to verbalize what is being written on the whiteboard and read aloud materials contained in handouts. So this is kind of the opposite of the previous strategy, in which you're catering to a student who respond well to auditory learning, but not so well in reading and writing. For those students who would like to be proactive in learning, you can also send students a copy of a book list or reading list for the upcoming semester or the upcoming class, so that the students can get a jump on things when it comes to reading assignments. And something I want to emphasize here is that adult learners with learning disability are more sensitive about being called out for their errors. So any additional help or intervention should be done in a discreet manner and should be perceived as facilitative as opposed to authoritative. And this is just because in many cultures around the world, again, we talked about this earlier, is that the newcomers, they have a sense of honor or a sense of yeah, a sense of honor and a sense that they want to be seen as normal, right? They don't want to be kicked out as someone who is struggling in any area. And students often work best with specific targets or goals. So clear roadmap of what each learner should expect during the course will be helpful as clear reference points. So this could be kind of practiced as having a syllabus or having a outline of what you're going to talk about for each lesson, right? And if a learner could have that outline in front of them, it would be easier for them to not be anxious about the upcoming class and say to themselves, okay, I know what we're going to talk about today. Maybe I can do some previewing of the lesson materials, or it will be easier for me to follow along with the teacher as they provide the lecture. All right, any questions regarding any one of these instructional ideas? Feel free to type them in the chat box or just unmute yourself.
So John, I'm just wondering, when should the ESL teacher be like concerned that a student has a serious like learning disability or ADHD, or like should they be diagnosed, or what should they do about them?
That's a very good question, Priscilla. I would say I can talk about my personal experience. So in the LINK program of the organization that I'm working with right now, when I was working at the LINK departments, I would receive referrals from teachers whose students have a benchmark in one learning area that is 2 to 3 benchmarks lower than the rest. All right. So, for example, if you're reading, if your ability to read is lower, is at a benchmark of 1, but for everything else, you're at a benchmark of 4, that would be enough of a concern for them to bring up the student to me as a possible referral. And when they also hear from the students that not only are they struggling in English, they're also struggling in that area in their native tongue, that would be a very clear concern for me. Does that answer your question, Priscilla?
Yep. So, well, we had the privilege of having John as part of our team in the LINK department. And what would you recommend other LINK teachers or ESL teachers who may not have like immediate direct access to someone who can guide them through it? Like, is there places, like how severe would, that they should consider referring the person to a psychologist or to their community, support or help support?
Right. So that really depends on the age of the student. If your students are in the adolescence age, then definitely, by all means, bring up the concern with your pediatrician, or even starting off with your teacher or your family or their family physician. You can make that recommendation that I think your child would benefit from an assessment, and from that assessment, what would typically come out of it is a education coding. So Alberta Education would provide a coding for students with a learning disability, and those students would receive extra funding to support individualized learning needs. And that could include, small group intervention, individualized intervention with a learning strategist, or with a educational assistant. and they might even be granted an assistive learning device like a scribe or a computer for taking notes. Now, for those of you who are teaching adult learners, that becomes a bit more difficult. What you can do is a structure of implementing intervention known as RTI, response to intervention. And I'm going to type this in the the chat box, so that all of you can either look this up online after this session if you're interested. So response to intervention. So essentially what this method of intervention is that it does not require a formal assessment or diagnosis. So for example, if you notice your student, and I'm talking about a link setting. If you notice your student is really struggling with a particular learning domain, so say listening or reading, you would provide the student with a saturation of resources or saturation of learning strategies that cater to their learning deficit. All right, and of course you would try to provide them with as much support, and you would encourage them to utilize learning strategies that correspond to their learning deficit as much as you can during class. And what you're hoping to see is that whether through through your curriculum-based assessments or through just daily observation, that you're seeing an improvement in that area of deficit. All right, and if you do see improvement over, let's say, a 1 month period, then you know this is working. Okay, and you would continue to provide that intervention. And if you don't see the intervention as working, if you don't see any improvements in their benchmarks, if you don't see any improvement in your daily observation, then that suggests to you that either they need a different approach to intervention, or they need more in-depth or more targeted intervention in a specific domain. Right. So, for example, if you notice a student with just general reading difficulty, and you provide them with a slew of just generalized reading resources, and you're telling them, you do A, B, and C, and you don't see too much improvement after implementing that, then maybe you need to think about, okay, are there specific needs within reading that I need to look at? Are there more kind of a basic or foundational knowledge to reading that they're struggling in? Oh, I see that they might be struggling with phonemic awareness. Let's try to do that as a targeted intervention, and let's see how well it works, right? And then after a month, you would reassess and see if that worked out or not. And if it did, then you can say, okay, so what I've done shows that the student responded very well to phonemic awareness instruction, and that's something I'm going to continue to do, and I will continue to pass that knowledge on to their next teacher, right? So that there is no gap between you and the next ELL practitioner. And I see someone wanted me to provide an example of explicit phonemic awareness instruction. So I'm going to take a look and see if I have some of those resources here on my computer. Okay, here it is. All right, could everyone see? So this is an example of explicit phonemic awareness. So I'm sure many of you are already have already seen this, or many of you have already used this in your. So you would say S is for snake, right? And then T is for tent or teddy. So this way, you're allowing your students to understand what each phoneme would represent in a word. Now, this is something that's, the more basic link classes would teach. However, not every single student has mastered that knowledge when they reach, say, CLB 3 and 4. Our hope is that most of the students who advance to such level would contain this knowledge, but many of them might not have. And many of the adult students, instead of saying, I don't know how to do this, they might simply say to themselves, I have a lot of compensation strategies, and that's how I'm going to be able to get through the class with, right? So what they will do is they will try to just memorize what a whole word sounds like instead of what each phoneme sounds like, right? And this is where this is just one informal assessment you can do to check if your students does indeed have this knowledge or not. You can just ask them to sound out each phoneme and see if they're able to do that. So don't present them with a word, but instead just phonemes and ask them to sound it out. And if they're unable to do that, that means they need to learn some of these more basic concepts to sounding out words. Does that make sense to everyone? All right. And now what I would like to show is a presentation I designed for the students. So this is a presentation I made specifically for CLB 3 and 4s. And what this presentation talks about is it introduces the concept of different learning styles to students, and also what different learning styles they can use to either learn quicker by using the learning style that they are most proficient in, or alternatively, to help boost the areas of deficit. Right, so those are going to be the benchmarks that are going to be the lowest for them. So, I first talk about what learning styles are, and how are the different learning styles used in your daily classroom learning. And then I show some examples for different types of learner, just using a simple example of making airplane. And then I also designed a very simple assessment for determining what their learning style is. This is called a VARC assessment. It's not something I designed from ground up, but rather I adapted this assessment to the needs of our newcomer population. So this assessment has just a few very simple questions. And what they will do is for each question, they will write down what is the one way they would ideally choose to complete a given task. So for the first one, it's, if you need to find a way to a shop that a friend has told me about, which of those methods would you choose? And you would see that instead of A, B, C, and D, I have K, A, R, and V as the responses. So K stands for kinesthetic, A represents auditory, R is for read or write, and V is for visual. So as they complete these 5 questions, what I would do is I would ask them to compile their answers to see how many Ks they have, how many As they have, how many Vs they have, and how many Rs they have. Right, and by knowing how many of those alphabets they have picked for their questions, we can get a very good sense of which learning style does this student respond most well to, and which are the learning styles that perhaps they might have a deficit in. So, for example, if a student picked out 3 Vs, 1 A, 1 R, but no Ks, that means they're really not a very good kinesthetic learner. And perhaps that is an area that they need to work on if we want to make them a very well-rounded learner, right? If that's the ultimate goal of the LINK program, then perhaps that's something we need to work on. Or, for example, they have 3 Rs, 2 K, but no V or A's. That means they're not a very developed visual learner. They're not a very developed auditory learner, right? Perhaps those areas are the ones that we really want them to kind of build upon, right? And then here is a simple activity that I would get the students to engage in at the end of the presentation. It's just to have a chat with the person sitting next to them. They will introduce themselves. They will talk about their learning style, and they can talk about what are the best ways for learning for them individually, right? And by doing so, we're kind of normalizing, differential learning styles. We're normalizing learning difficulties as something that you can just readily talk about in the classroom. And this is also something I would like them to talk about back home in their family as well. So hopefully by providing them with this education, they would be able to see differential learning styles not as something that they should feel stigmatized to talk about, but rather it's something that we all share as human beings.
John, there's a couple of questions. How easy is it to change adult compensation strategies? And then the other question is, would you be willing to share this presentation as well, as it's very well put together?
Oh, thank you. Mandy, I would love to share the second presentation as well. So I would send that to Priscilla and Nancy there. And as for the first question, how easy is it to change adult comprehension strategies? I would say that really depends. I've seen adults being able to change their compensation strategy because we were able to implement targeted intervention to help them boost the area that that was a deficit to them before. Right? You have to remember that compensation strategies are only there because of a given deficit. That compensation strategy really doesn't serve any more purpose once we can implement targeted interventions. Yeah, Julie, is the goal to round out their learning styles or capitalize on their strength for completing various tasks? I would say definitely. So I would actually show a slide here for my students. I'll show you this slide here. It's on. Yeah, so on this slide, you can see I put.
We're not seeing it, John.
Oh, sorry, you're not seeing it?
No.
Okay, let me try this again. Okay, can you see this?
Yeah, it is showing.
Okay, perfect. So in this graph that you can see here, I talked about the different activities or the task that they can engage in, depending on which area of deficiency that they're struggling in. So, for example, if you're a if you're struggling in terms of learning as a visual learner, you can learn by looking at charts, graphs, using graphic organizers, lesson outlines, picture aids, and PowerPoints, right? And this by no means replaces your existing learning style, because it is easiest for them to withdraw from those learning styles that are in line with their deficits. It will be easiest for them to use the ones that are considered their compensatory strategies, right? That's just human nature. So you want to let them know that if they want to get better at being a visual learner, they need to use those visual learning strategies along with whatever their given strategies is now, right? So when you combine those two together, they will be able to get better in that specific domain. And you can also use a strategy called scaffolding, where you provide you provide as much explicit instruction and direction as the student needs initially. And as they kind of familiarize themselves with the study strategies for their specific deficits, you can slowly withdraw those additional support or the scaffolds around their learning. Yeah, and for the person that asked, can I share the assessment I designed? Absolutely will. I will send that as a Word document separately along with the PowerPoint. Yeah, no problem. Any last minute questions?
So if you have any other questions, you can type in the chat box, but please don't leave yet, especially for those who are in the Calgary local chapter of ATESL. If you are a paid member and active, we are going to have the lucky draw section. So please don't leave just yet. Well, thank you, John. Thank you for the wonderful presentation and your generosity to share all these materials. I think a lot of us have learned so much today in a short 1.5 hours. Yeah, and yes, Vanessa, there will be we are recording this session, and hopefully we're able to share that as well. We have one more question. What resources would you recommend accessing for students with speech difficulties? So last question, and then we're doing the lucky draw.
So resources for speech difficulties. Which type of speech difficulty are we referring to? Is it problems with sounding out phonemes? Problem with social communication? Lisp or stuttering?
That is a very difficult question, because that usually, I think, would be worked on by a speech therapist.
Yes.
So
now I could put together some just generalized tips. What I can do is I can also send that to all of you as a Word document, if you like.
Yeah, that would be really helpful. So John, is it okay if I take over presentation? Because I want to share the lucky draw. Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Priscilla, and thank you everyone for being such interested participants to this presentation. I hope you've learned something today.
Okay. Thank you, John, once again. And